Hello and welcome to Failure and Analysis. My name is Kevin Jordan, and I'm here today. We're going to talk a little bit about game design. I feel like lately, in a lot of our favorite MMOs, item design has been leaving a lot of potential on the table. Um, those systems haven't been delivering as many exciting choices. I think part of the reason that Classic is being looked forward to so highly is the itemization used a different philosophy back in the day. It took more risks and it was more interesting, more compelling. And the theory crafting on it still continues to this day, which is pretty interesting. Um, Whereas in today, item level sort of rules, and we don't really look at the items anymore. And some of this has bled over into other games. I've been playing Final Fantasy 14 quite a bit, and I see item level, and that's the only decision I make: is it higher than my previous item? If so, then equip. If not, don't. So, yeah, let's talk about some of the basics of item design, how it relates to encounter design, and how it can create a lot of really interesting strategic choices, both at the macro level and the individual level, um, and provide a lot of interesting loot options um, if if you have enough content and not enough interesting items. I'm not sure. I haven't played enough to know if this is actually a problem, but one of the problems back in the day was, how much content are we going to have and how many items are we going to have that are different from all the other items available in order to make sure that there's plenty of things dropping that are exciting for players throughout all the content that's available. So, um, even the simplest sort of system can allow for quite a few items to be dropped in various places in the world to make for a pretty fleshed out, tapestry of items to choose from. So I'll start with some of the basics. Like for any individual, like a DPS class, let's just say there's only two attributes on it. There's DPS, oops, and um, survivability is essentially the category. But yeah, I guess let's just call it that. So there's damage and survivability. And obviously things are more complicated than this, but these are the basic two choices or the two common things you would find on an item for a DPS character. These are the two choices he would make. And then how do you create an item that's interesting, or several items that are interesting decisions for this player at a specific level, at a specific quality as well, because obviously every 5 levels you're offering new gear potentially. It could be as often as every 10, depending on where you are in the game and how fast those levels are accrued. But yeah, so you want interesting choices to make. And I also hold to the fact that this should be an interesting system regardless of where you are in the level range. So um, it shouldn't matter. Like this shouldn't only turn on when you're at max level. This should be something you do, at level 10, level 20, level 30, level 40, level 50, all the way up, right? And but those levels have to be meaningful in today's MMO genre. Leveling is a chore. There's tons of ways to increase your XP gains so that you can bypass it really quickly, or there's things like heirlooms which replace the need for any of these systems to actually be vibrant and enjoyable. So uh, the but in a game where leveling is part of the process and it's a fun part of the process, this is how I feel itemization can lend itself to making that an interesting part of the process. So here are potentially 3 items. Actually, there's quite a few more. We'll just make them as we go. So there's the 2/3, 1/3 build, which basically just says which basically says 2/3 of the attribute pool. Most items have an attribute pool. You put so many points into this and so many points into this, but for a quality and level, you only have this many attributes to apply. So 2/3 of the attribute pool goes to damage, and 1/3 goes to survivability. The other option is 1/3, 2/3. Typically less desirable in most cases, but this is again where encounter design plays in. We'll talk more about that later. But this is another option to boost, your survivability, which could be important for PvP. You want to strike the right balance. It could depend on your class. Are you a front-loaded, burst class that has to kill a target like a rogue before they break out of stuns? Or are you, more of a long-term, wear them down kind of thing, which could influence that decision. There's the 50-50 build. This item is usually a little less interesting and could be tossed out in a lot of cases where you have enough items. I think these are more compelling. The fourth option might be the values you could argue, but let's call this one 4/5 and 0. So total attribute pool is not being utilized here, but you're specialized in one or the other. So the other is 0 4/5. And yeah, the cost of specialization, you usually have to put in, but you may not, depending on, again, how many risks you want to take. Because across all the item slots, this could end up being pretty dangerous. But it also could be the kind of thing where you offer full value, 5 out of 5 on these specialty slots, but or the specialty items, but you only offer items like this in specific slots to try to combat that extreme case. So that's probably a better way to do it, just in terms of making each item feel like it's not being shortchanged. But specialization usually has to come at a cost somewhere else. And then a 6th item slot might be something like 1/3, 1/3, and then proc or special mechanic. Something individual about the something individual about or unique about this ability that has specific uses. People still have to math out, and there's ways of leveraging either its damage or its survivability in a way that makes it special or desirable or best in slot for certain encounters or certain environments, that kind of thing. So, and this could be 6, 7, 8, as many as you want to do, but I leave that category sort of open-ended. But yeah, so you've already got potentially 6 items per quality, per level, per gear type or class type, depending on how you do your equipment restrictions. So for WoW, it would be plate, mail, leather, cloth, assuming that all of those had these choices. And so it's already quite a few types of items, and that's with 1 damage attribute, by the way, and 1 survivability attribute. Yeah, sustainability is an interesting one. I actually put that in damage. I consider those to be functionally an element of damage because um, sustainability is essentially going to determine how long you can do damage or what your damage efficiency is at various time points. So it could be considered a separate attribute. And obviously damage could be like in WoW's old case, could be strength, AP, haste, crit, hit. Um, all of these things are damage. And then depending on your build, depending on the things going on with your rotations, depending on the type of fight, these could be weighted differently. So there's potentially even more. There's tons of crunchy little things going on within this system. But even if the game were based on two types, which is just damage and let's say health, then you'd have quite a few types. And so then, in total, players can come up with different builds. They can come up with, the glass cannon builds that are just all DPS. Max DPS, low survivability. They could have the all-rounder build, which is sort of a mix, half and half DPS, half survival. They can have the tough build, which is low DPS, high survival, or max survival, I guess. And so those are sort of the three types of builds you can make, and there's tons of variability within that depending on how many slots you dedicate to what things. Sets are typically built with the all-rounder idea. Because if you equip the entire set, it's usually designed such that you get healthy amounts of all the attributes, and then it adds set bonuses to break it apart in terms of here are some additional bonuses that we know you'll like that may change your gameplay a little bit or provide extra advantages in different areas. And that makes it, those make them really nice, and they usually end up looking really cool on top of it. So, and then all the other pieces are sort of geared to do one thing, right? Yeah, Terragor. There could be a specialization cost for 2/3, 1/3. This is again very rudimentary. The math needs to bear out. This is the kind of thing that I think through, and then I would hand to a technical designer, the super mathlete, to see if it actually bears out. And then you would adjust over time if you found players are all doing this because there aren't enough mechanics that pressure survivability or for whatever reason, then you can adjust things in a lot of different places to figure out how to get some of these pieces to be more desirable. So then we talk about mechanics that leverage these different types and how people might approach content, assuming they have all options. And they never have all options typically when they go through content, especially as they're leveling up. They might miss entire sections of options and before they get to the next level bracket, depending on how they play and what they're doing, how efficient they are at leveling. So in a new encounter, you tend to want to be either tough or all-rounder because you don't know the encounter. So you want to be able to last a long time to figure out the encounter, gauge as many of its mechanics as possible. until you defeat it. Once you know the mechanics, you probably you pick the best one for defeating the boss. And this is again the sort of the DPS centric, because there's also tank and healer that are making their own decisions. But and then once you beat the boss and you sort of put it on farm status, and your gear starts to come in from that boss, you switch more to the glass cannon because you're getting more survivability as you're gearing up, and you can switch to just making the fight shorter to farm it faster. Which are all compelling decisions or interesting decisions, and require that you've hunt down and found all of these different options so that you can have these choices, which again makes targeted loot hunting really compelling, because it's like, if I'm 2 glass cannon coming off the last encounter, we're going to be going into a new fight, then you might spend time gearing up more survivability pieces so that you can be closer to the all-arounder or tough going into the next fight, so you can learn it. And so let's look at a couple of encounters. Some are DPS checks. So DPS check, it puts very little pressure on the DPS in terms of damage, and so they literally are like, worst case, or most extreme case, it's just a target dummy sitting there. It's on the tank, and there's no way you can pull aggro, and you're just literally sitting behind it, or ranged at range, just maximizing your rotations, pushing all the buttons in all the right orders, trying to get that thing down. So it has an enrage timer, is basically one way of doing DPS check. You have to kill it in a certain amount of time, or else it's going to wipe. And so you wear the glass cannon. But if you go in as tough or all-rounder, you're going to find yourself failing, right, the first time you fight this boss. Because you're going to be a little more tentative with your DPS anyway. You're going to spend more time potentially moving around, or not really fully understanding that it's a DPS check until it's kind of too late, and then you're not going to pass the DPS check, and you're going to fail because the enrage timer is going to hit, and enrage timers usually wipe. That's how they're designed to work anyway. So then you switch to the glass cannon for the next fight. Okay, and then there's a cool moment here for strategy and socialization. The guild's going to sort of collectively understand, okay, this boss requires a DPS check, and so we need to, each of our DPS need to go glass cannon, and then that's sort of the maximum, the big picture strategy layer. And then each individual DPS gets to go and look through his gear and find the best way of accomplishing this goal. And if he doesn't have the gear he needs, he, has to go spend some time, in like a raid setting or a dungeon setting even, where you hit dungeons or raids on the weekends or something like that. You spend your off days hunting down those pieces. You talk to people, you might look up websites, find out where some of these pieces are, and then you go hunt them down. And you'll find that everyone sort of has their mission on how to get whatever it is they need. The tanks have needs, and the healers have needs as well, and you might find other people that, oh, I need a piece out of that dungeon too for my whatever my strategy is. So it's a cool thing you can do together or by yourself. And there's also there's a lot of like miniature moments within those, experiences that are really cool, because you go to a dungeon. It may not be the hardest thing in the world because you're sort of past it, but every time a piece of gear drops that is one that one of your glass cannons was looking for, everyone sort of celebrates, not only because you got a piece of gear, but because um, you know that you all sort of have an increased chance come next raid or next dungeon encounter that you're struggling with, that you're going to beat the encounter. So there's a lot of excitement and build up throughout the week about that next experience every time one of these pieces drops, even though you're doing content that's essentially farmable for you. So that can be really fun. And again, the itemization is key to that. Whereas no one can go back to old dungeons now that are on farm status and really enjoy themselves because they're not going to get anything out of there that's item level is comparable with what they're currently, testing at. Except with Titan Forging, which again is another bad. It does a lot of damage to this because if there was something in here you could get that was better than what you could expect to get in the thing that you're fighting for, it actually ruins that excitement. So, because the guy's going along now and he knows it's unlikely because he won the lottery in this dungeon that he's going to get an item that's better than what he already has. So, it's difficult to expect once you won the lottery to win it again. In other words. So those can be really fun moments, and that's just one type of encounter. There's other types of encounters that are going to, high damage encounters. So this is one where, if you're a melee DPS, the boss is like constantly spamming AoE damage that's keeping you on your toes. And so you have to be either tough or all-rounder in order to survive this. So you do less damage, but you do more damage over time as long as you're alive. So if you go in his glass cannon, and the way this might work is, let's say you have, 2k health, as a glass cannon, and you have 4k health as an all-rounder and 6k health as, the tough guy. And just as a very simple example, every 30 seconds or on some time frame, he's doing 3k damage, to the melee DPS. So the glass cannon can't even take that. So he's dead the first time, this event fires. It's putting so much pressure on him that he can't actually take this damage. And this is a rough thing because you rarely want to one-shot people, but sometimes you have to put significant pressure on people to get out of the glass cannon. And this can certainly be done at higher end content or challenging content, like big raids and things like that. And in this sense, this is unavoidable, or it's avoidable, but only if you're sacrificing your ability to damage things. So, in avoidances, you run so far away that you can't actually do your job, which is just as bad as essentially being dead for that amount of time. So yeah, glass cannon can't take this hit. So this approach is out. All rounder is also it's better. He can take a hit, but he's hard pressured to take 2 hits because he's going to probably rely on the healers, right, to be dumping heals on him. Or he can be using cooldowns and pots and things like that to try to mitigate this. Or, again, he could find like the piece that's best in slot for this, which is like if you get hit for more than half your health, this thing procs a big heal, right? And then all of a sudden you have a belt that's just like, this is best in slot for this encounter. I'm going to take that. And the rest of my pieces can be all rounder or even a little bit of glass because I have this item, which is a super cool moment. And then tough is great because you can't take it twice, but with just a little influence, you can push it over so you can take it twice. You know, with just a heal potion or just a just a button that's on a cooldown, you can get past that. So you can take it twice, and then you need help the third time, depending on cooldowns and how often this is and whatnot. But and so this then puts a different kind of pressure on this really simple system. And obviously, there's tons of granularity to work in, which you need in order to keep encounters kind of fresh for a game's lifetime. When you're talking about 15 years of making different kinds of tests. So that's another type that requires, and then all rounders sort of in between. The encounter's just kind of mathematically tough for your group, and it needs a little bit of both. So there's the all-rounder fights. These tend to be less interesting, or provide less interesting choices, but they can be done occasionally too. I feel like a lot of the dungeons at the lowest level in WoW are sort of this, like it's like easy all-arounder, like you don't really have to think about your gear. They're not doing anything really, special. It's going to challenge. It's just sort of a speed bump. Everything's a speed bump. Takes you this long to kill it based on math, and you can up that a little bit by having slightly better gear, but nothing's actually making you think about the gear you take and how you're going to optimize. So yeah, there's just a lot of things going on in this very simple system that can be very compelling for the player in terms of how he gears, how he targets his gear, acquisition. And it gets even more complex and crunchy and interesting if there are multiple damage stats, if there are multiple survivability stats, because different classes have different mechanics that desire different things. These are obviously add a ton of interesting, unique choices to be made. And then, what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, they have more longevity, some pieces too, because you might get one of these pieces, for example, in a lower tier that lasts you a while longer because until you get the piece that's like this in the next tier that could last you a long time. It might be best in slot for you for a while, especially if the next tier doesn't necessarily have these, because not all tiers of combat are going to have all of these choices, especially when you talk about the level up tiers. So this can get really compelling really fast, and this is a lot of what happens in vanilla. But yeah, encounter design has to play into it. Encounter design and item design have to communicate a lot, or have leadership that actually has a solid idea of what this structure could be, and he communicates effectively with the other groups, all the other groups, and then class designers also should be pulled into these conversations whenever necessary. But yeah, it doesn't take much really to create an environment where gear is a really fun thing, and adds so much strategy and gameplay to just the moment to moment. And this is like the bare bones of, again, it's like one stat for damage, one attribute for damage, one attribute for survivability, and 3 types of encounters, or even just 2 types of encounters. And these can get crazy because, like, once you get to the raid level, it's like there's different phases. We didn't even talk about the difference in, like, on the tank side, it's like the 3 stats could be, damage or, threat per second, essentially. Survivability. And I'll break this one out just to illustrate my point. Physical survivability and, magical survivability. So I was thinking about this some last night too. Like if I had to do it over with the 3 tanks in WoW, would it be cool that warriors did the best damage and threat per second? Paladins had the best magical survivability, and druids had the best physical survivability with high armor and health. Um, and these guys had the auras, you know, for extra resistances and things. Um, and then, you know, when I say best, I'm talking about like they're at the 100% mark, and the other classes might be at the 95 or 90. So, um, you know, it's not like you couldn't take a paladin to do this, um, this side of things. But optimally, um, you would want the one for that thing. But in raids, it's like, okay, well, the first phase of this encounter is you just have to threat the crap out of it because it's a DPS check, and you need to make sure that the thing doesn't turn on your DPS. So you want a warrior for that part of it. The second phase, he starts spamming magic damage, so you want a paladin to step in and do his thing. So you have some, tank swapping in the same fight. That's not like the tank swapping we're used to, which is he's building up a dot, or he's building up a survival mitigation or a survival damaging thing. And so you have to swap the tanks in that way. And then the last phase is he just does tons of physical damage. So the threat doesn't matter as much. He's sort of brain dead and he's just attacking what's in front of him, but he's doing a lot of damage. So the druid has to step in, right? That's a 3-phase fight that could require, one of each tank. And if you don't have a really high level druid, for example, then maybe the paladin tanks that second part as well. And it's just you're a little bit worse. But you can cover it with extra healing or really good healers, whatever it is. So yeah, this gets really compelling really fast. But yeah, you have to have different types of gear that are designed this way, and I feel like item level is just killing this because people don't really look at the attributes anymore. And also the item level restrictions play into why this is pretty poor, because like it used to be, okay, we're going to go to Scarlet Monastery. We're going to check it out. Monastery is a good example because it has several wings in front of you. We're going to try the easiest wing. It turns out it's a little too easy for us based on our skill level and our gear. So then we skip to the max level one. That one's too hard for us. Again, because of our skill level and our gear, it's set us to this. So the middle one's just right, But with item level restrictions, you wouldn't even be able to get into this one, and you probably wouldn't be able to get into the medium one. I should actually write these things down. You wouldn't be able to get into the medium level one because you're in the cases where you're skilled enough, but there's no factor for skill being judged by the game. So it doesn't care how skilled you are. It wants to assume that you have a high enough item level to mathematically defeat it unless you're completely brain dead, is typically how the item level thing is set. So you can't go into this one. You can't go into this one. The only one you can go into is the one that's too easy for you. And it's just too easy. It doesn't challenge you. It's not that fun. It doesn't cause any of these decisions in terms of how do I gear myself to get through this experience, whereas the medium probably was, and the hard really was. And the hard, you might, or the high level one might be that you were only just a little bit off the pace. So a couple pieces out of here for your group, and you're back in here and making good decisions and pushing this content. But item level is going to be like, nope, you can't even come close to stepping into that one for a while. So keep farming medium. So yeah, item level is doing a lot of damage there as well, because you don't even have to make these decisions in a lot of the content. You either have it or you don't, and there's no distinction between these because it sort of assumes you can do the content, and you kind of can do the content regardless of these decisions. So in fact, so much is about clear time and rate. Almost everyone is this. And the danger is that item level is determining your ability to do this based on only one build. And that's really not fun for, you know, people making compelling item decisions. So there you have it. I talked for a long time. Let me look at chat a little more just to see if there's any really compelling things going on in here. I know you guys have been chatting. Some additional points. Yeah, hit me with any questions, or if I missed something, point it out. Yeah, and Sleep, you mentioned the the community and the meta and the perception of that meta. I sort of touched on that in the like everyone thinks about clear times now. So glass cannon is pretty much the way to go. Splitting DPS stats and hybrid DPS stats. It's a little complicated for this video, but yeah, that stuff gets really compelling and really interesting. Not only from like a min max level, but also from just a gameplay standpoint. Because when you have different damage attributes, people really might like haste or plus crit over, the bread and butter sort of attack power, or their main damage attribute. Because of the flashiness, the feel of attacking really fast, and they might find out later that that's actually poor for their build or whatever, but that's part of the process too, which can actually be pretty interesting. And then that person feels kind of like, oh yeah, I had fun for a while, and then I learned how to really do it, and now I feel much more confident and in control, and I feel like I've mastered, my character a little bit more, my knowledge a little bit more. I'm not the noob I once was, which is a really important part of game design, is that sense of mastery over time. So, but yeah, this one is like, the other thing is just reiterating how important this can be, to counter this, like just making it so people can't do just maximum damage all the time at the cost of survivability, because then it's one attribute that matters instead of even just these two. You have to make this one matter. This one tends to matter automatically in PvP scenarios, things like that, but encounters have to stress or pressure survivability at times in order to make this decision compelling. But all right, well, thanks everyone for watching. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe. Come follow me on Twitch, and we'll see you next time.